Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Any questions about anything? Administrative questions? Lecture. When you're getting your $100? We made some bet, right? What was that? Oh, 100%. Yes, you'll get your $100 when you get 100% on the homework. Okay. So, yeah, quick reminder. Homeworks are due today. And then homework 3 is also out today. So you'll have a continuous stream of homework that you can do if you wanted to. And I realized that for the proposals, I think at some point I had said that they were due today, but I had also said it's due on Friday, so it's due on Friday. So the submission for the proposals is online, and only one team member has to submit the proposal. And then last thing, I think I said this already, next Monday, no class, it's a holiday. So we have even less class than, yeah.
For the proposal, can we change it later on as we progress on the project? Or?
Yes, yeah, so the proposal is not setting you guys in stone for what you want to do for the project. We're trying to be as productive as possible, so trying to give you feedback at an earlier stage. But if you find that it ends up not being tenable, it is okay to change that. We just want to make sure that that's happening now rather than right before it's due. Okay. All right, so we're gonna just quickly pick up where we left off last time because we ended a little bit early. So going back to thinking about the system models and specifically in the category of bottom-up models. Oh. Simulation models. So this is slightly different from what we've been talking about before with sort of optimization and simulation. You don't necessarily require, a minimum or maximum type of objective that's being met. Instead, you're often trying to replicate either behavioral rules or some associations and relationships between pieces and elements of your energy system. And so, yeah, doesn't have to follow a cost minimizing pattern, therefore not really an optimization. But you can employ things like game theory, accounting, anything that would replicate how either behavior or trajectories would be seen in the real world. These can get fairly detailed, right? If you think about the level of nuance that you can get to. And so from a perspective of like data requirements and modeling requirements, like these can get just as big as some of the like big complex optimization models. Here's a list of a couple examples. Notably, so the National Energy Modeling System, also called NEMS, is a model that is put together by the Energy Information Administration. And so this does essentially national forecasting of the energy system for the US. And it's the sort of de facto forecasts from the government. And in fact, very useful for those of you who are sort of less familiar with this. The annual energy outlook is what is generated by the National Energy Modeling System. And so if you wanted to look at like baselines of, oh, what do I think renewable adoption is going to look like in the future, or EV adoption, or what do I think fuel prices are going to look like in the future? There's a lot of, let's say, scientific criticism or backlash of some of the numbers of these sometimes, but at the end of the day, like a lot of people use results generated from NEMs as the basis of scenarios that they may use, or as like a starting point for modeling exercises. So we can dive in a little bit more into NEMs just to get a sense of its coverage and the level of detail. So this is a diagram showing kind of the pieces and individual elements of the module. So we can see there is a section on demand, and there is a section on supply, similar, right, to the times model diagram that we had seen before. And that gets integrated into your central module that takes all of the inputs and does calculations for ultimately your outputs, right? So the macroeconomic trends and international energy activity, these are pieces in addition to the supply and demand that are like exogenous inputs into your integrating module that eventually gives you, all the results that I was just mentioning. Yeah.
So when you're trying to match, does it match supply with demand? In doing that, does it not do any sort of optimization of sorts internally?
Not really in the sense that we're thinking about running like an optimization model. It's more like trying to line things up. Yeah. But we can, so this is a very high level view, and we can see kind of the level of detail that we're about to get into here. So as an example, if I were to dive into specifically like the transportation demand module, we can see there's all these other pieces of it. So the transportation module gets fed into your sort of larger system. But here, for example, you have light duty vehicles, air travel, and freight transport. And there are a whole bunch of pieces of each of these submodules that you need. So, what are the size classes, vehicle types, technologies, fuel efficiencies that are available in the light duty vehicle sector? And these go through other submodules to do calculations, right? So what the energy demand looks like through all of these submodules, and then calculations of what the emissions are associated with those energy demands, right? So that's how you would get to, for example, vehicle emissions. But wait, there's more. So if I wanted to dive specifically into the light duty vehicle submodule, that's sort of this thing here, right? And so all of these attributes that I was mentioning over here are actually components of other small sort of modules. So they actually have like a consumer vehicle choice component, which is like a very simplified choice model that's figuring out what vehicles are being adopted and that sort of thing. And that this might go through a stock accounting model. So that would tell you, okay, here are the new vehicles getting added into the fleet every year, and then some number of vehicles are getting retired every year, right? And so all of this is part of that initial simulation piece, right? And we can continue to go down the rabbit hole if I wanted to look at within the LDV submodule, this manufacturer's technology choice component here goes through this sort of diagram here. This is a simulation piece that includes policies. So this one right here is the CAFE standards, which is a requirement for fuel efficiency levels. And so you can see at certain places within the submodules, they're actually able to inject like policies into it. And that's one of the nice things about NEMS is the baseline for NEMS every year has to update. It's required essentially to include all the laws and regulations pertaining to and that would affect the energy system. And so what you guys will see this year is how, for example, the inclusion of something like IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, will affect the energy system in lots of different ways. And if you like back all the way out to the user-facing part of the annual energy outlook, which is the outputs of NEMS, there will probably be this really simple thing where you just click a checkbox and you say, oh, I want to see what happens with IRA or without IRA, and then it will propagate all of the results for you. So it's a kind of nice, simple tool that lets you see effects of different policies. Okay, any questions about NEMS? Yeah.
So, software similar simulation
Yeah, it's not in Excel. I actually don't know what NEMS is. Does anyone know? Does anyone happen to know? I know that it's like it's publicly available in the sense that you can get access to it, but one of the big criticisms of NEMS is that it's so complicated that even though you can technically kind of play around with it, you would need to build up a lot of expertise before you're able to actually run it. Yeah.
How do you know which parts of the system are exogenous? So things like you could change in your own way. So maybe something like cafe standards, I imagine it's exogenous. You can feed that into the model.
No, so the piece that's usually used and accessible to the public, the annual energy outlook, is just it's kind of set in stone. It's like there and that's it. And you can't really mess with inputs at all. There are some like options that they've preset for scenarios that you could look at, but other than that, there's no real way to influence any of it. If you're talking about like downloading NEMS and then trying to run it yourself, like any almost anything is customizable, right? Like any set of inputs that you want can be changed.
We go beyond that checkbox thing that instead of just checking something, some policy that you want to see the impact of, maybe you could modify it further and say, for example, for IRA, what if the tax credit for certain energy technologies was different? Can you do that, or is that?
You could technically do that by going into the actual NEMS model, but you would not be able to do that on the annual energy outlook. Yeah. In fact, why don't we, I wasn't planning to do this, but why don't we jump over to that website just so you guys can see what it's like. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, I have no idea what that is.
There's a NEMS with hybrid.
Yes.
Fortran? Yes.
I know. So the AEO or NEMS used to be in Fortran, yeah, but it's definitely not anymore. Okay. So this is the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and the annual energy outlook, as I was mentioning, is an annual release that gives you the updated results from NEMS. And the piece that's probably the most interesting, I think it's this one. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so basically, you've got the outputs of whatever it is that you're interested in over here. So what we're looking at right here is like energy production from a bunch of different fuel sources, and you can see these are in units of quads, and they give you the table, and you can download the table. Yep, that's right. Yeah, so if you want to work with this programmatically, it has an API, which means that I can basically query it through a variety of like programming languages in a very standardized way. So it's not like you have to like scrape the website to get the data. It's like a call and response type thing. So they also will provide some, plots. But the thing that you probably care about the most is going to be here. So like in the annual energy outlook, here are all the tables that you could look at. So for me, I might be interested in like the transportation sector and how many like electric vehicles are going to get adopted. So I would jump down here, and then I would look at light duty vehicle sales by technology type, right? And so you can see that here they have, this used to be really different, but now they have 100, 200, and 300 mile electric vehicles, and then the plug-in hybrids and so on and so forth. And you can go up here and, choose what you want to display here, if that's what you want to do. And then cases and scenarios. So here is where they would put like policy levers. So we have a reference case, and then they have a bunch of different scenarios. So certain types of credits, looking at carbon prices. Yeah, and sometimes I've seen a variety of like different types of policies, and there might be somewhere else that you can toggle that, and they might change depending on the table as well.
So in the actual model package when you download it, you can modify what low economic growth looks like, what high economic growth looks like. You can modify those individual cases and scenarios.
Well, no, these are set, right? So if I wanted to do this, it would just tell me each thing in different scenarios. If you're talking about fundamentally changing the inputs of the model in some way, you would have to be working with NEMS itself.
The download thing, that's just CSV.
Yeah.
That's not like the model.
Yeah. No, the model.
Where do you download?
Somewhere. I don't know. Maybe here, data tools. It's not. It's not something that I would recommend that you do as like something like a casual, I want to look at what happens if I change around these things. This is like a dissertation level amount of work that would go into understanding the model and then like updating and changing it. Like there have been people who've done that. Yeah, actually, the current head of the EIA, he was actually, so he's a professor at NC State, and he created his own version of the annual energy outlook called the Open Energy Outlook, which is meant to be like a much more open source, easily modifiable, easily more like accessible version of AEO to turn it into much less of a black box. And that effort required many years, many students and postdocs. And it's kind of cool that now he is the head of the EIA, and he probably is trying to make some changes to the annual energy outlook to kind of be similar in some veins to OEO. Yes. There's a lot of precedent with NEMS and its use in energy systems modeling in general. Okay. And so, yeah, to get there, you have to go through all of these things, right? And this is like a submodule of a submodule of a submodule of the whole NEMS, right? Okay. Any questions about NEMS? Okay. So, wow, this is kind of hard to read. It's like green for good, red for bad, kind of. Top down, bottom up. We've talked about these two sets of models, both of which come with their own pros and cons, right? So with the top down, endogenizes economic and social effects with better consistency, but usually the big criticism of these types of models is that, you know, if you're talking about working at the like economy scale and looking at macro trends, you usually don't really have the ability to do dive into detail into specific technologies. And so like your outputs are often generalized, which, right, would be the pro side of your bottom up. You can incorporate a high degree of technological detail, and you can look with much greater fidelity at sector or technology specific policies and other items related to those. Bigger drawback for these guys is that compared to top down, oftentimes the like data requirements for doing bottom up types of modeling is way higher. And particularly if you're doing, if you're focused on sector specific modeling, or, you know, not a sort of complete picture of the economy, like let's say that you're only focused on the transportation sector, right? You can imagine that there are these feedback effects that might influence other portions of the economy that you could miss. So one example of this is like hypothetically, if you transitioned all the way to electric vehicles and you had some crazy model that was looking at that, well, the fact that you're reducing gasoline demand might affect like the power sector in certain ways, right? Because that could affect the oil and gas industry in certain ways. And so those type of feedback effects would be harder to capture in like sector specific models. Yes.
Sorry.
No.
You know, any like the BP does it yearly energy review. Do you know if they get a lot of stuff? I know they use EIA. Do you know if they have their own internal model, you know, or is it stealing a lot of stuff? Not stealing.
No. They do their own internal modeling, and they're particularly good at, you know, certain aspects of that. But yeah, the basis again, the basis for a lot of that type of thing can be deriving data from NEMS. Yeah.
Based on what you said, it shows relationships a little better than sector by sector sideways.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean they're using like photometrics? Like I guess there's a bunch of methods.
Mm-hmm.
More linear regression, semi and non-parametric regression.
Yeah, so the way that I would think about it is less about necessarily the like methodological approach, which does inform, you know, some of these drawbacks or benefits, but it's more about the idea that you're thinking about things mainly from the lens of like a macroeconomic perspective, right? Where you're like focusing on the underlying or the trends as opposed to the underlying factors that are affecting those trends. So that's the top down. And because the bottom up is looking at those underlying factors, the level of detail there often means that you don't have the ability to extend that all the way to like the entire economy. It's just too complex. And that's why you run into some of these issues. But it's trade-offs. No. NEMS is just a particular type of bottom-up model. And yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry. So to back up real quick, right? So we're talking about energy system models. Last time we talked about a bunch of different types of models, and the high level categories is like top down versus bottom up, right? And so bottom up includes things like simulation, like NEMS, but also optimization. And what was the other one that I had covered last time? Does anyone remember? Input output is top down. Partial equilibrium is bottom up. Yeah. So again, there are just trade-offs within these types of things, and actually it's why there's a lot of hybrid system models that kind of take elements of both. Yeah.
Would you ever do both of them for the same topic to like, validate one another, just to see like what the magnitude of difference?
Yeah.
the model produces?
Yeah. So the researcher that's developing the like model itself is likely not doing something like that. They are putting all of their effort and focus into the development of that model that they're focusing on. But yeah, that having been said, it is fairly common to do model comparisons. There are like, it's kind of like the next higher level where you'll have researchers do comparisons of different types of models to see what sorts of outputs are like, and try and align them as much as possible. It's not always possible to compare like total apples to apples, but you can get a decent view of where there's alignments, where there isn't alignment, and then trying to figure out like why models might not be aligned. And in fact, we'll look at some comparisons in just a second. Yeah.
So is there some way to hold a simulation model accountable by looking at the simulation, the forecast it generates, and comparing it to the real world values and where the discrepancy comes in?
Yeah. So okay. So validation of energy systems models is a important thing, super hot topic in some ways, but then totally irrelevant in others, because you're talking about like trying to do forecasts of your energy system on like decadal time spans. And so to do validation, it's like, well, I made these energy systems models to look at what the future is going to look like in like 2040. So now I'm going to like wait around until 2040 to like validate my models. That's not all that useful. So there have definitely been analyses that have tried to do like retrospective looks of these models.
Have they fared well? Like, do they match up?
No, they always do terribly, but usually they do terribly, but that's not the point, right? It's more about whether the like assumptions that are driving the model are realistic, and and even if like your inputs don't line up with what happens in the future, it's like if you were to go back and like change those to what you actually observed, yeah, it's about understanding like relationships and levers and that sort of thing. So all models are wrong and some are useful. So we want to try and get at what parts of the models are useful. Yeah, and I think I used to be a lot more skeptical of these models, but I think that they are useful, and we'll talk about some of that in just a second, and later on in the class, especially when we talk about policy stuff, we'll see why. Even if you're not perfectly predicting the future, there is still a lot of use for these systems models. Okay, on to today's lecture. And I'm kind of mixing some of the lectures up a little bit. So I'm jumping forward to integrated assessment models. Yeah, and I'll talk about why at the end. Okay. So integrated assessment models, you can think of as a sort of subset of your energy systems models. But oftentimes these guys are also integrating with like climate models and environmental models to understand not only the anthropogenic side of things, which is really what we're talking about in the energy systems models, but also the natural environment side of things. So we're like continuing to build up in size and complexity. So climate change fundamentally requires an interdisciplinary approach, right? It is something caused by humans, and so the anthropogenic side of things is needed, and elements of that are needed to understand and combine with the natural side of things. So linking features of society and economy, which is what we've mainly focused on with biosphere and atmosphere, into a single framework. So disciplines include economics, climate science, energy systems, land use change, agriculture, so on and so forth, right? This is a highly interdisciplinary field and requires expertise from large groups of people. And the reason why we do this is so that we can have a unified framework to assess impacts on climate change, as well as the levers that can help to mitigate that. So integrated assessment modeling takes in drivers of integration, methodological aspects of integration, and then the pieces of the system that you want integrated, right? So we think about what stakeholders are needed, what the concerns are, and then the sort of policy settings and the types of interventions that you can do. So those are your drivers, the pieces that we want to include in the modeling, the human setting and the natural setting, and then from a scoping perspective, the sort of time and space. And in terms of doing the actual modeling, integrated assessment models, you have to think about what sort of methods you're taking, what models and data are going in, disciplines, and then it kind of gets its own thing, right? Sources and types of uncertainty. So doing energy forecasts is inherently uncertain. Doing climate modeling is inherently uncertain. You're combining high levels of uncertainty across sort of layers and layers of models. So it's important to be able to talk about and show the types of uncertainties that will be coming out of your integrated assessment modeling. So there's generally two categories of integrated assessment models. So you have a cost-benefit integrated assessment model. So I don't know if folks have heard of these, but models like DICE, PAGE, and FUND are really sort of fundamental models in the cost benefit category. And a lot of what these are doing is essentially just calculating the social cost of carbon. And we'll talk about what that is and why that's important in just a second. Then you have process-based integrated assessment models. These are typically way more complex. You can almost, there's some sort of analogy to thinking of this as like a top-down versus bottom-up. It's not really that way, but the idea here is that you're delving into a much higher level of detail into your energy technologies, into the demand, and behavioral elements. And so the types of things that you get out of a process-based integrated assessment models are things like projections of like technology adoption, and yeah, those, and ultimately like impacts on the climate and that type of thing, as opposed to this one, right, which is mainly focused on that, calculating that social cost of carbon. So we'll move through this. We'll look at the cost benefit IAMs first. And before we get to that, let's talk about social cost of carbon. Yeah, so this is has everyone heard of a social cost of carbon? Yeah, okay, so very important concept, right? So we're dealing with climate change and the impacts of climate change. And that is caused by the fact that we have anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions that are a result of activities that we do, right? And so transportation emissions, for example, who's driven a car or been in a car or in a bus in the last week? Yeah, like everybody, right? So one way we can solve climate change is that you guys can all stop getting into cars and stop getting into buses, right?
Only 25%.
What, 25%?
Reduce PM2 by 25% by 20.
No. I'm getting rid of carbon emissions from transport. So no more cars,
Okay.
No more buses, no more airplanes, no more trains. You guys are not allowed to do that anymore, right? Huh? Yeah, no more transportation. Stop moving. Right? So that's the solution to climate change. And so why would this probably be a bad idea?
Incredibly infeasible to tell the entire world to stop.
Well, even if you could, like, would you tell everyone to stop?
Even if I could, no, because that would, like, it's
We would solve transportation
you
emissions.
would quickly be out of
Yes.
power.
Yeah, we will create another, like, ton of other problems, like if nobody can drive anymore, our supply networks would crash down, we wouldn't have food anymore, we couldn't go anywhere anymore, like. We couldn't do
Yeah.
anything.
So the
my thing
At the
is
beginning
smart
of a lot of died, but then
so the
People would die.
yes. So the point, right, is that transportation has negative effects, right, which is greenhouse gas emissions, but it also has a lot of benefits. Okay. And so if you were to get everyone to stop using transportation, stop driving, you eliminate those negative effects, but you also lose all of your benefits. That is what the social cost of carbon is, right? We could get everyone to stop emitting carbon, and then that would get rid of all of the costs associated with carbon emissions. But you have a bunch of benefits associated with that. And so the social cost of carbon is, from an economic standpoint, the level of reduction that you would want to reduce damages to offset, let's say, the amount of benefits that you're willing to lose, essentially, to reduce the damages. It's when those are equal, right? Does everyone understand that concept? Yeah.
Is it similar to how they set carbon prices where the marginal damages intersect the marginal abatement costs? So
That is the social, yes. Yes. But at like a global scale average across all damages, essentially.
how do you come up with all damages?
That's a good question.
It's very subjective, like, full value benefits and
Mhm.
damage difference.
Yes, which is one of the most controversial pieces of the social cost of carbon. It's so one, the damages themselves can be very difficult to capture, but even if you could capture them, like how do you choose the sort of valuations for certain types of things, right? And so that's why actually a lot of models exclude, let's say, like ecological impacts, right? So what is the cost of a species like going extinct, right? It's a lot of these things can be very, very difficult to monetize. And so that is a piece of conversation that I don't want to hate on economists, but is often lost in that conversation. And so I think, but I do think that if you talk to reasonable economists, that most people will agree that like what we determine as sort of the social cost of carbon is probably an underestimate of its like true sort of value. And in fact, so this is an estimated social cost of carbon. It's kind of agreed upon by a variety of people. And actually, this is a baseline that people have kind of taken in a lot of existing like policy regulation and legislation. So like the US often uses the 3% average number in pieces of regulation.
Generate this or what?
So we'll see in a second. Yeah. Those integrated assessment models that I was talking about is how you would come up with these.
Like annual, yes.
No. Yeah. So researchers, academics, they are sort of like a lot of the integrated assessment models that are built to derive these are like how should I say, like multi-institutional cooperation, cooperative like modeling efforts that go into some of these. So why, okay, so these are discount rates, okay? So why are the values different at different discount rates? Yeah.
The carbon accumulates in the atmosphere and you get the worst effects of emissions now in the future.
Yes.
Your discount rate goes
Exactly. So damages from climate change happen out in the future, and the value that we put on future damages has to be discounted, right? We've covered this discounting idea, and therefore, at higher discount rates, that means we care less about future damages, which means that those damages get valued downwards. So $14.51. So you can see how big of a difference these sort of things make. So like I was saying, so these values generated from a conglomerate of integrated assessment models that have sort of agreed on these, and these values are widely used. So one comment about that, I don't know if anyone saw this when it came out, but just a couple months ago, a really big paper was published in, I think it was Nature Science, where there was a huge group of academic researchers and economists, and it's like almost like a who's who list of people, where they did a reevaluation of social costs of carbon, and they all basically said that it should be at like $200, not at $50, right? So even here, even though there is like a robust methodology going behind the sort of calculation of these things, it's still not agreed upon. And like at $200, right? So if you think about this as the motivating factor behind what sort of abatement measures we are willing to take, right? So like, as a society, if we accept social costs of carbon, it means that like if light bulbs cost this much to change, and then induction stoves cost this much to change, and then electric vehicles cost this much to change, we'd be willing to go all the way up to here. And then maybe, you know, carbon capture is like over here somewhere. That's like not worth doing because the cost of doing that are less than the damages that would be caused in the future. But at $200, right, that changes the that really changes the equation in terms of like what you should be willing to do to fight climate change. So that paper is a big deal, I think, and people are rethinking some of this stuff right now. Yeah.
I remember that we briefly talked about some philosophers and arguing that we should have like a 0% discount rate or something.
Yep.
What would happen to the price of social cost of carbon if we had a 0% discount rate? Because I imagine it would be way higher than what we see over there.
Yeah, it would essentially mean that like we would value damages in the future as we do today. So it would just jump out somewhere. I don't know where it would be. It would be somewhere here. Yeah.
In practical terms, when like thinking about like the Inflation Reduction Act, that IRA, and how tax credits are calculated, and you know, let's use the hydrogen, the PTC,
Yeah.
$3 per kilogram or something.
Yes.
Like some of it, was any of that based on the social cost of carbon 51 at that time, in terms of how, like, was it included in the model that produced, hey, we want to do 3, or was it just absolutely like that? It was just like, hey, no, we know it's X amount, and we're just going to kind of net out 30% of it, or whatever the number is, and then say.
So I can tell you that people are certainly knowledgeable about where that $50 is, and then they would know where like a production tax credit would lie relative to that.
Yeah.
But it's not the end all be all of like has to be below 50. It could be above 50. It's just a guideline that people think about.
Oh yeah, no, I guess it's more just the how did they get to 3? Was 51 a part of that model that got to 3, or was it just a
I doubt it.
comprehensive stakeholder engagement process?
Yeah, I doubt it was part of the. I mean, it's part of the decision-making process insofar as some of the people are aware of that number, but I don't think that really. I mean, I don't know for sure. I wasn't the one who came up with that number. So, yeah.
How did they elicit these discount rates? Were they just assumed, or did they do a survey of sorts?
These are not elicited discount rates. These are assumed social discount rates, right? So that's why they give a couple different numbers, right? What is the correct discount rate to use for society? That is a philosophical question. That is not something that you can kind of elicit it, but not really.
Shouldn't there be a counter incentive there? Because yes, you value future damages less, you're not going to live that long, but
yeah,
then you also value present benefits more, because you know that there's a climate risk, and in the future those benefits.
What benefits are you getting from burying carbon into the ground like today?
So benefits from not having a social cost right now, the benefits that essentially that current payoffs are way more valuable than future ones out in the distant future.
that is how discounting works, but I'm not sure like
I'm
what.
saying, wouldn't a climate risk inflate that discount rate? Because they know that in the future there's an existential threat to, let's say, any of these assets. And the fact that the climate risk would leave some of the returns null and void. Would that climate risk inflate some of that discount rates if you try to elicit them from a society like, okay, how much do you value, or essentially how much do you value current payoff, given that some years into the future?
So discount rates apply to both costs and benefits uniformly. So having any of these would address, I think, what you're trying to say here, right? Because it's not really that discount rates are going to differ for a benefit rather than for a cost. I mean, in theory, it might be a little bit different, but.
So if you try to elicit it, and it'll be uniform across benefits and costs. And
here's the thing: eliciting social discount rates is not useful for climate policy because most people aren't making financial decisions based off of what's going to happen after they're dead. But because we as a society have decided that we care, we say, don't try and come up with a discount rate based off of how we're behaving financially. We just need to create a social discount rate that will get us to a future that we want. Yeah, exactly. So yeah. So what I'll say, okay. So I think that you have a fundamental question of like how these numbers are generated. And what I'll say about that is it is a philosophical thing more than a empirical thing.
If you're like a business and you're trying to make an investment, right? And let's say you're a small business, you own a set of bike, like I don't have enough information as a business owner to like know the climate damages of my investment.
And importantly, the important part of that perspective is, let's say you are a laundromat, and then you are climate conscious, and you charge twice as much to clean and dry your clothes because you've decided to purchase green energy credits, and you're like, oh, I'm going to be a green laundromat. Okay. And then next door, there's another laundromat that just doesn't care. And they offer their cleaning at half price. It doesn't help anyone that the green laundromat goes out of business because they're charging more money. So even if you are like an environmentally conscious business, like unless a social cost of carbon is like uniformly applied to everybody, like a tax, right? Then you go out of business even though you're well-intentioned, and then it doesn't help, right?
So that's the next one. IPCC established like a $40, I think.
No, this is $40 is old. $40 is like.
But that's the highest it's been implemented in reality. It's 38 by 10. So.
Oh yeah.
So the point is, first, why do you choose not the 200 for yourself?
Oh, this is because this is like I should include a slide about that paper, but I thought of it as I was talking about this slide.
Then why do you say that disconnect from policy? Policy really.
No. This is like the scientists telling policymakers, like, hey, like, here's the number you should use for your carbon tax. Maybe it's not perfectly accurate, but it's better than nothing. And I think 51 is old. I think it's up to like 63 or something now. But yeah.
On one level, technical side, I'm sorry if you already understood this, but how is time represented? Is that right?
No, these are just dollars. So think the way to think about this is like you get to go out like infinitely into the horizon and calculate all of those damages and then create the social cost of carbon. And the reason why you can go out 100, 200, 300 years into the future is because the contribution of the costs 200 years into the future is like nothing because of the discount rates, right? Yeah.
So if you're going that far out, or if these models then account for the stock of carbon and the inflection point, so to say beyond which the climate system becomes increasingly unstable once the stock of CO2, GHGs in the atmosphere. I mean, there's uncertainty around it, but IPCC says that we have these certain inflection points beyond which the damages start growing like this, and is that accounted?
Yeah.
If you go that far in the future.
Yes. We'll see that in a second. Yeah. The other piece of social cost of carbon that I think is really important to talk about is the non-uniformity of this by country. So this is a really cool plot. It's a little bit complicated. So let me kind of try and walk through this. This is the same plot as here. It's just the zoomed in part over here. So you can kind of see with a little bit more clarity. So on the x-axis is the share of global emissions. It's a little bit of an older paper. It was published 5 years ago, and they're using older data. But the farther right you are, the more emissions that you have, that you're sort of contributing to the world, right? So China has the highest emissions, followed by US, followed by India and Russia, and so on. Yeah?
Is it based on production or consumption? Because I think there's a big difference, especially in terms of US and China. But like, also the argument that China produces a lot of things, but it gets like consumed in Europe and America. So
yeah, exactly. So this is production, and you can think of this as consumption. So this is the global share of your social cost of carbon. So if you are above this line here, right, that means that you are contributing more to that social cost of carbon relative to the amount of global emissions that you're having, right? And so we can see that sort of dynamic here. And then the color, yeah, this is a 4D plot, right? So you have your x-axis, your y-axis. The color tells you the social cost of carbon per million, so the per capita. So the redder you are, the worse an individual in that country contributes, okay? And then the size of the dot refers to GDP, so the size of the economy. So the larger the dot, the larger the economy, okay? So the damage per capita is the color. Yes. So when we have these the big climate summits, all right, COP, and you have your like Paris Agreement, and you guys have heard things about like these negotiations between countries about who should be dealing with climate change, right? And that countries get back out all the time, and they're saying, oh, we have to deal with too much. And like the US, some countries argue that like US and China should be paying for paying a like disproportionately larger amount, right? That's right due to the relative contributions that you can see those discrepancy in the chart. So if everyone were on this line, then we would be sort of like equally responsible, but that's not the case. Yeah.
Does it account also for the absorption of the CO2 emissions?
Yeah, that should be accounted for in the like social cost of carbon part of it. Yeah.
And does it make sense also to have like this kind of graphs, but stated by sector of the economy? I mean,
You didn't think this was complicated enough, right?
why do
You certainly could.
I mean,
My brain would melt, but
not split by countries, but
instead do it by sector. Yes, you could.
Industry, Mexico's transportation, United States
Yeah,
industry,
exactly.
transportation and per capita.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
That is transportation, Saudi Arabia is just oil.
Yeah, no, I think, when this came out, this is a really cool figure. It shows a lot, but it's also kind of confusing. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully you guys are getting a sense of a better sense of what social cost of carbon is, and also why it's important, right? And the sort of nuances there. So Len, let's actually go into talk about the modeling behind that. Yeah, so cost benefit integrated assessment models. There are just kind of a handful at the level at that serious level that people are using this for, developing some of these cost numbers that really go into informing policy. So DICE model is one of them, and there is an optimization component, so you guys should know kind of what that means, right? But importantly, a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of in these two, right? Thinking about the energy system, this is like the anthropogenic piece of it, and kind of what I'm getting you guys to take away from this is that it's now integrated, right, with a set of climate models. So these things are your natural system, right? So this thinks about how emissions from human factors are leading to things like, or how they're essentially contributing to atmospheric effects that lead to climate changes, right? So changes in like temperature and so on. And some of this can actually feed back, right? Temperature changes can affect well, obviously, right? That's why we care about climate change, right? So it affects your human economies and society in certain ways in this sort of loop. And so you figure out what happens in order to assess ultimately your climate damages.
That looks at it over that long time horizon.
Yeah, we'll see some results in a second. Page model, similar type of thing. Another example of an integrated assessment model, right? You have your human side of things, your economic model here, and then that's linked to a climate model. So that's really all I'm trying to sort of display with these model diagrams, that you've got these sort of, we're expanding from our energy system and economic models out to these natural systems. And so you can also imagine, how should I say, like procedurally, right? That this requires a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration, because economists don't know anything about atmospheric model. Well, some do, but yeah. That's a lot. There's a lot behind the scenes here, right? That you can imagine.
What does equity weighting mean?
Yeah, so equity weight, we're gonna have an entire lecture about this, but
How it impacts the
different people differently.
population, right? Have a higher impact on different.
Yeah.
So the page model output tell us group-wise impacts based on what sort of income bracket you're in. Is that why equity weighting?
Not necessarily.
No. Yeah, this is mainly in here to think about feedbacks to damages. Okay. Comparison, DICE fund page. they look at, different things, but so DICE, they have non-sea level rise damages and then sea level rise damages. And then some of the other models have a lot more set of categories of damages that are calculated. And so, right, probably the most striking thing in this comparison is the fact that the models don't have a huge amount of agreement in terms of what your damages from climate change are going to look like, right? And that has to do with the assumptions of what types of damages should be included, but also fundamentally has to do with some of the inner workings of the models and assumptions. Yeah.
Why is it so low? Why is it on like dollars per, it's dollars, it's not in thousands, it's in single dollars, right? So we're saying it's $4 per ton of CO2.
Yes, but these are annual damages, right? So you have to integrate all of those damages down to one number. Sorry? Discontinuity. Actually, I have no idea.
Is that time on acceptance?
Yes. Yeah.
There are climate models with projections all the way to 2300.
Yes. Yeah, because depending on the discount rate that you choose, like these damages might still be showing up a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Like the famous number is 1.5 degrees. Those are overlap. Like everybody will be dead by the first 20%.
No, not everyone will be dead. I think that's a lot of people could die, but yeah, like not everybody. Sorry, what are we saying?
Sorry, that was extreme.
But okay, what was your question?
The temperature rise.
Yes. So I believe these are kind of assuming that like business as usual. So the temperature rise could be, I should say I'm not 100% sure, but I usually think that that's what the cost based ones are doing. So your temperature rise, I think the business as usual is, does anyone know? It's like by 2050, it's like,
Right now, it's like two
degrees and over.
It's like,
wait, for business as usual? I thought it was, hang on. I have a table, I can answer this, one sec.
it says two.
Oh, by 2050, okay, 2.4. Okay, yeah. I was thinking 2100. So 4.4 by 2100. Okay, oops.
There you go, just all the
Yeah. All right, so that's the cost-based estimates. So basically, punchline, right, is that there's a lot of uncertainty even amongst different models, which means that our value of our SCC, who knows how accurate that is. And again, that's compounded by the fact that that paper came out recently that said it should be like 4 times higher. Yeah.
So you go to the previous slide. So yeah, this is tells
Don't
you,
grill me about this. This is just.
This just tells you the damage to society in terms of what would be that social cost, but not tells you if the social cost is implemented as a policy, what would change. Is that what this model is trying to tell, or is it just trying to?
No, that does not do that. Yeah, that's what the process-based integrated assessment models are. So great for that transition. Yeah. Benefit costs, integrated assessment models are highly aggregated to calculate SECs, and they're relatively simple. Process ones are going to give way more detailed results, but they're also a lot more complex. So how do these work? High-level schema of an integrated assessment model. Right, we had been mainly focused on energy system and kind of energy system and economy before, and now again integrating with climate, which means you have other sets of assumptions and inputs that you have to account for. So it gets more and more complex. And the other part of it is that we care a lot about policies and how they may change things. And so instead of just economic outcomes, emissions, and energy pathways, also we'll have land use changes, and it should have another one, climate impacts, right? Climate impacts we care about. That's one of the big ones, yeah.
Are these just then like simulated LCAs?
That is a extreme simplification of.
Yeah, I know, but like, it looks very similar, like, it's like the LCA models that exist.
Yeah,
Any of
no.
us are in that class right now, so I think that's a lot of, like,
No,
similarities, no?
no, it's definitely, I mean, it's similar in the sense that you like want to include everything, I guess, but it's not like LCA. We're thinking about assessments of like a specifically scoped thing.
Right.
These integrated assessment models are trying to assess like everything.
If you wanted to scope do an LCA the entire economy, you have to, it's like really hard.
Yeah, but it's not just the economy, right? It's like the economy, emissions, technology. It's got like atmospheric modeling in it. Like, I don't know how that would pertain necessarily to like LCA. Yeah, okay. Okay, if you really want to put it that way, it's like the world's most complex LCA. Sure. But that's neither here nor there. Yeah.
In the previous slide, what's that energy pathway mean? That outcome, the third outcome there?
Yeah, so this might be something like if I wanted to reach like a climate degree target, what energy pathways would I need to take? So that would mean, you know, how much coal do I use? How much like nuclear do I use? How much, you know, electric vehicles am I using? How much biofuels am I using? That sort of thing. So this is what we. Yeah, so usually, I mean, there's parameters within the system that you might modify. So like things like elasticities or something. But a lot of the levers at this level are mainly focused on policies that you can change. Yeah. Humans could go extinct. That would be one way to solve climate change. That's not really what I think.
Yeah, there's like this one. You're from working on policy White House. Why are, I know there's many critiques to carbon tax.
Uh-huh.
They definitely do.
So
Why hasn't it gone to then maybe levelized?
yeah, okay. So carbon, so I could have an entire lecture about carbon taxes. So if I were an economist, what I would say is that we should do a carbon tax. That is the most efficient thing that you could do. And there are aspects of that that I personally would maybe not necessarily agree with. I think that the uncertainties about where you would set a carbon tax, right, is pretty big. So and I do think that there are some fundamental things that a carbon tax would struggle with in like a big transition like this. But that having been said, I would be all for a carbon tax. And I think from the most realistic point of view, that the reason why it hasn't happened is that people don't like taxes. It's like a political thing more than a like an academic thing in terms of like, it's not, no one who works in climate change and energy.
People not want to tax it into like Shell spending $2 billion.
Yeah, but okay, so yes, so maybe I'll retract that statement. I'll say carbon taxes are politically one of the least favorable things that you could do. It's failed almost everywhere that it's been implemented or attempted to be implemented.
IRA.
Not passed. Yeah.
Wasn't it in one of the first versions
Of IRA?
of Build Back Better? It
No.
was in one of them, and Ron
Oh,
was like, yeah,
oh,
I'll
oh.
support it, I'm in for it.
But whatever. Like that doesn't really matter until it passes. So, anyways, political. It's political more than anything else. Like academics don't disagree that it would be a great thing to have a carbon tax. Like we may disagree on the efficacy of a carbon tax, and we may disagree on like on whether you should do like more command and control type things. Like certainly there's debate there, but like no environmental climate change person would say no to a carbon tax. I can.
Fear of political backlash or
Yeah.
like billions flowing in.
I don't know. Like I'm not a politician.
Well,
It's just
it's not like for the people who vote against it, it's like it's a tax, and you don't need another adjective on it. Just a tax, no. Right? It's like philosophical. What
Yeah.
There's no tax. Right?
Yeah.
So you can do tax, you can do something. What? That is no because they don't believe. No, it's not.
there's so he's talking about, so there are what is that group called? Do you guys know? There's a specific subset of Republicans who refuse to move to do anything with taxes. They're like super anti, this was really yeah. Well, there was like back in the 90s, this was like a really famous thing where like there were a couple people who just like would not budge and would not negotiate on anything related to taxes. There's a name for this group. But anyways, yeah. Okay, what I'll say is I don't think it's productive to maybe talk about the politics of this too much. Yeah, if you have a good understanding of carbon taxes and social cost of carbon and what that implies, we'll take that for what it is from an academic perspective, and just know that it has had difficulty passing at a sort of legislative level across many governments. Who knows where carbon taxes are currently implemented? Yeah, there's a couple European countries. California has cap and trade. It's a similar type of thing. We'll have a lecture about that. Yeah.
But in Europe they have it, and they have like you do it like a sectorally specific or something approach where they like, because they know it's like, okay, industry, you're
Yeah.
really hard, we're gonna help you get there, and so it's like
Yes, so there are like carbon-based fees in like the transportation sector in the EU. But okay, so there are some places that have it, but you really, like a proper implementation would require a carbon tax to be implemented across the globe. Yeah. Yes.
I just want to note that while I agree that it might be a good idea, or a lot of people say it's a good idea, I had a class last quarter when we talked about cap and trade and carbon tax and there's different like forms of.
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the carbon tax is actually the like least likely to succeed, because if you only tax something, it doesn't really change anything. Like if you would tax a lot of transportation in California, but wouldn't, I don't know, increase spending on public transport or anything, people would still need to get to their class and everything. So would really change their behavior.
So the other side of that, which is what economists will argue, or some economists will argue that a cap and trade does better, is that so once you enforce a carbon tax, suddenly you have a whole ton of revenue, right? You tax everyone, and now you have all that tax money. So the question is, where would you spend that revenue, right? And so that revenue, ostensibly, you would want to try and promote things like what you're talking about. Cap and trade kind of does that automatically,
You also
kind of.
Isn't California auction some allowances?
Yeah, cap and trade, but that's different. Yeah.
There's 27 countries, and this is, I guess,
Yeah.
Mexico has a higher tax than Japan.
Yeah. So
US is zero.
yeah, so one of the implications of not having a uniform tax is like, let's say California decides to have carbon tax or cap and trade, and then now you move your business across to Nevada instead, right? So that's a common type of thing that happens. All right, back to the models.
Just the last one, there's
Yes.
countries paying, Uruguay is paying 137
Okay,
per ton.
yeah, that would be great if we could do that everywhere.
I think the PUC has to have a social cost of carbon in that program.
Yeah. These are these very well-known, very large-scale integrated assessment models. As I was mentioning, these are the product of really large cooperations between different institutes and so on, right? And so, GCAM, for example, is a really well-known one. And even though like some of these are just listing the main contributors, but like there are hundreds of scientists that get, that you could tag onto a lot of these, and there's like different versions and so on and so forth. So these high resolution integrated assessment models, it's a really big lift, and they have big teams working on them. Here is a model diagram of the image integrated assessment model, and you could like,
Do you have a zoomed in version of that?
yeah, definitely. So, but includes, all of this stuff. So economic growth and wealth, technology, natural anthropogenic emissions, policy levers. So like if you wanted to look specifically at this piece here, right, we could look at specific parameters, related to your energy system. And so these are some of the pieces of that. And then you can see, if I zoom in here, again, in the energy system, how some of the interrelations work between these little sort of modules. And then you can imagine that any one piece of these that I could zoom in on, and there's a whole bunch of detail that goes into that.
There is also like sub-modules within modules.
Yes, probably. I've never really tried to look into these myself. Yeah. But we have done some evaluations of like outputs of a lot of these models. GCAM is another really big one. Some of the things that evaluate social economic development, compliance with climate treaties, technology and resource developments, energy policies, and again, complex model diagrams. Not going to go through everything, but you can see that includes lots of components, again, of both your economic and energy systems, but also of your climate system. This one has a lot in land use as well. And of course, you can go into specific components, get more detailed, right? You can continue to zoom in on these models. So GCAM in particular, I should maybe update this. But this is for AR5. So this is one of the 4 models used for representative concentration pathways. And I'll show what that is in just a second. So GCAM has participated in like every major assessment of the climate over the last 20 years. And it's one of the 6 models used to create the SSPs. Again, I'll show what this is in a bit. And yeah, literally hundreds of publications based on GCAM per year. So the RCP that I'm talking about, these are, so this is from not the current IPCC report, actually the last one. I don't know why I didn't update to AR6, but AR6 did just come out. So this is what we expect the CO2 atmospheric concentration is going to look like across different RCPs, different pathways. And what these refer to are pathways of radiative forcing. So this is, so if you remember, the sun hits the atmosphere at about 1,000 watts per meter squared. By the time you're at ground level, you're more sort of like 350 to 375 watts per meter squared in sort of average across the globe at equilibrium. So we would increase that number by 2.6 watts per meter squared. In this pathway, it would increase by 4.5, 6, and 8.5. And so that extra energy in equilibrium in our Earth means that the temperatures will essentially rise, right? Because you've got more sunlight energy basically getting retained within the atmosphere. And so the way that we get to that radiative forcing is by these sort of concentrations of CO2. And so these are the kind of like pathways that the IPCC puts forward in terms of like what our potential futures could be. I've been talking a lot about IPCC, so let me give a quick rundown for folks who are maybe less familiar. So this is the intergovernmental body of the United Nations that are supposed to provide objective and science-based information of risks associated with anthropogenic climate change, right? So this was established 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program. It's comprised of thousands of scientists and experts across, all variety of things related to climate, energy, industry, and so on, right? And actually, it's all sort of on a voluntary basis, and you get representation across a huge number of countries all across the world, which makes meetings a terrible pain sometimes, but so IPCC is comprised of 3 different working groups. Working group 1, 2, and 3. So 1 is thinking specifically about the climate system. 2 is vulnerability of natural systems to climate change and like consequences. So this is kind of like climate and climate impacts. And then working group 3, which is probably the most closely related to the stuff that we're doing, is thinking about what the options are for limiting greenhouse gas emissions and what the associated impacts would then be, right? Yeah.
So we have process-based integrated system. Could that look at how the social cost would change if there were adaptation measures in play, or does the IPCC do that? So
yeah, it does that.
Okay.
Yes. Every couple years, the assessment reports get released. So FAR was the first assessment report that was first published way back in 1990. And there have now been 6 reports released, with the last one actually getting released just last year. Actually, maybe in the final draft came out this year. It was either this year or the end of last year. Yeah, the AR4, every scientist who worked on AR4 actually was awarded with a Nobel Peace Prize. So it's actually been very popular to try and become an author now, and it's actually very difficult to become an author for IPCC. Yeah. Yeah, we're not getting any more Nobel Prizes. I can tell you that.
You said we? You were working on it?
Yes, I'm an author on the transportation chapter 10 of IPCC. Yeah, and that was, like I said, the actual report writing and everything. It takes quite a long time. So I was working on it since 2019, I think, or 2018, and we like just finished it, and it's on a voluntary basis. And you got to wake up for those guys in Australia, because sometimes working in different time zones, that's just how it goes. Okay, so common conditions across integrated assessment models. So this is a different sort of set of scenarios. I think these are probably a little bit more relatable than the sort of RCP categories. So these talk about high level sort of like representation of what we do. So socioeconomic challenges for adaptation, socioeconomic challenges for mitigation. So does everyone know the difference between mitigation and adaptation? So I don't know why I'm asking these rhetorical questions, because I'm going to tell you. Mitigation means that we reduce our CO2 in order to combat climate change. Adaptation is how we deal with climate change, right? So, you know, increasing efficiency, using cleaner power, switching to electric vehicles, those are examples of mitigation. Putting up seawalls, right? What other examples of adaptation? I don't do adaptation, so right. So you know, putting up barriers to deal with sea level rise, that would be an example of adaptation. Yes, yes, moving away, moving due to climate-induced stresses would be an example of adaptation. So, you know, ideally, you would want both, right? And if you do less mitigation, you have to do more adaptation, is usually how these things go. And if you don't do either, right, this is like where you would end up. We call it a rocky road, I guess, high challenge.
Because regional rivalry there. The climate works or
Regional rivalry is I think kind of the what like these are describing the challenges, right? And so if like nobody's cooperating, then you end up with that type of thing. Okay, and so
Migration and wars with water.
yeah, yeah. Like no consensus on how to deal with climate change. So these scenarios each have associated impacts for global warming, like estimated, and then the and then uncertainty ranges around them. So those SSP scenarios you can see here. AR6, the latest report from IPCC, they had a sort of categorization. We introduced these things C1 to C8, which are kind of indicators of like how it's kind of like the SSP essentially. It's basically saying, oh, how much are we going to deal with climate change? And this C1 being like the most aggressive, with C8 being like the least effort being sort of put forward. And so now we have these 8 scenarios, each with sort of ranges in terms of what the global warming is going to look like. And these are really just kind of markers for, if you actually go into the report, you could see like, oh, if I wanted to see how transportation sector is going to look, we have specific like C1, C2, C3, you know, outcomes for, you know, all the different sectors and what would happen. So you can go in and associate a particular sector with, or you can associate a particular scenario with outcomes at even a sectoral level. IMP. Oh, IMP. Actually, that's a good question. It's one of the, I forget the abbreviation. This is, it's like SSB. It's one of the set of scenarios that were sort of included in the like climate outcomes. It's essentially another set of scenarios. This figure is one that came out of the reference for policymakers part of the report. I really like this figure, so it was so controversial, but this essentially tells you what options do we have to mitigate climate change. Okay, these are all the technologies across different sectors. So in industrial sector, transportation sector, in buildings, in energy, this is in agriculture and land use. There can be substantial uncertainty as to how much they can actually reduce. So the size of the bar refers to the total potential of a particular technology to reduce emissions. And so if you just look at the size of the bar, right, where are our biggest? It's switching from our energy sources to wind and solar. It's doing carbon sequestration, conversion of forests, fuel switching, right? And then the colors refer to how much it's going to cost us to do that. And so blues actually mean that you're going to save money. And then these are costs per ton. And if you think about our conversation earlier about the social cost of carbon, at $50 per cost of carbon, I'm going to do like all of these things. So maybe this stuff, all of this stuff, you know, this stuff, and so on and so forth. If you're at $200 a ton, you're going to do everything. Okay, so that's the kind of difference that the social cost of carbon can make. Yeah.
Does it assume these costs when a technology of CO2 mitigation technology is deployed at a certain scale? Because I would imagine that something like CCS, this is the first of the kind technology, the cost right now will be much higher than what they would be if it's deployed widespread. And
yeah, you can imagine there's a lot that goes behind this. It's complicated, but yeah, we would think about those things for sure.
Electricity. It's so expensive.
Sorry, where?
Bioelectricity, it's twice and it's very expensive.
Oh, bioelectricity with CCS.
Even without CCS.
Oh,
There. It's
here. Yes, so bioelectricity is like using biomass as a combustion source. And the idea there, you're still burning, which releases emissions, but then the production of the biomass is, right, you're growing plants, which takes in CO2. So the idea is that there's some kind of balance there. And yeah, there's some, I'm not necessarily saying it's bad. There are some things, nuances to think about with that. Yeah. So what will energy consumption look like across our different SSPs? These are different integrated assessment models that are giving us these different sets of results, right? And so some of them might be different, like message, for example. I don't know why it's a lot higher there. but it's breaking down sort of primary energy consumption in each of our sort of different scenarios, and as well as the amount that we actually use. And so in the most aggressive climate mitigation scenario, you'll see, right, that the energy demand is actually quite a bit lower, and our proportion of renewables in blue is going to be higher than sort of more on the right-hand side. Yeah. So this is like left to right. It's like trying to do the most to deal with climate change, and this is kind of like doing the least to deal with climate change. And so when we think about the outcomes that are arising from all of these integrated assessment models, right, generally the consumption of primary energy is lower on the left-hand side than the right-hand side, and generally like cleaner sources. So blue is going to be bigger on this side because that's renewables, whereas fossil stuff, coal, oil, and gas are going to be a lot higher on the right-hand side. And this just gives a sense of what we think is going to look like in 2100. And again, remember, this is like 80 years into the future. We'll probably all be gone by then, right? But then there's a lot of there's a lot of uncertainty going out that far into the future, and so you see sort of this scatter of different types of results. Yeah.
The curve on the far left is that 500 hectares primary energy that we use per year, as in 2020, 2021, or whatever it is.
Yes, that's right.
So then there's this, we're saying that like
That there's not going to be a growth in the amount of energy consumption.
it's not.
In here, basically, it's not much of a growth,
Yeah, like.
right, compared to here. Yeah.
But, and because that, I have a hard time understanding why, like, sure, the allocation of different primary energies, I can understand why they would be different. I have a hard time understanding why the total amount of primary energy.
Population growth.
Are you assuming population growth?
Yeah,
So-
these models definitely
so
put in
you're saying
population
we
growth.
don't grow population.
No, not necessarily. It's probably that over there you have less population growth than over here, and you probably have better energy efficiency. Yeah. So it's a combination of both well, it's the demand, which is a combination of population and energy efficiency and other factors like that. Okay, and so yeah, so this will kind of lead us into thinking about making a difference. So energy systems models, right? We think about these smaller scale ones building up to these larger and larger ones that inform things like integrated assessment models, right? So a lot of the system models that maybe we were talking about earlier, you know, focusing specifically within energy system, or even more nuanced, like within a specific sector, those things can help inform some of the larger, more complex models, right? And so you will have systems of these that go to help inform large assessments like IPCC, or like the domestic one for the US, the NCA, that's the National Climate Assessment. And the idea is that hopefully it makes some kind of impact with policymakers, right? And as well as the public, who can also have an impact in sort of different ways than policy. And this is kind of meant to transition us into future lectures about policy, but I've kind of restructured the syllabus this year compared to past years. But I do want to maybe poll you guys about where you would like to see us go. So do you guys want to do more deeper dive into modeling, so looking at examples of systems models, and understanding what they do, what goes into them, that sort of discussion, and look at, again, specific examples of, specific categories? Or do you guys want to do more about policy, the policy world, and how modeling has informed our sort of world of energy policies? So who votes for models and who votes for policies? So models, raise your hand. So we're going to strictly just do by count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, and how many people want to do policies? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, sorry. So
What's your
Billy's
vote?
not here, so. Isn't
models? Could you not have like a middle ground where you?
we can, no, I was just thinking that maybe we can, yeah, because there's like 3 extra lectures. Maybe I'll do like 2 and 1, or like 1.5, 1.5. Okay. I just wanted to get a sense of where everyone was at. That'll be helpful for me. Okay, great. So that's it for today. That is our wrap up of integrated assessment models.
Thank you.